Clinically and conceptually speaking, psychoanalysis is just complicated as hell. And all the more so when you focus on the technical and theoretical tradition extending from Freud to Lacan. If you were to press me on it, though, I'd say we can summarize it like this. Freud overhauled the function of knowledge, and Lacan discovered an economy of enjoyment therein. Chapters 8 and 9 of Seminar 20 are about both the overhaul of knowledge and its attendant economy of jouissance, but also about what binds them together in psychoanalytic theory and technique, the speaking body, notably that of the other sex, by which, of course, we mean the body sexed feminine. Between the overhaul of knowledge with which Chapter 8 begins, check it out, it's on page 91, right at the start, and the economy of jouissance on which Chapter 9 ends, page 116, check it out. There is much for us to consider in these chapters, but really only one key passage, which amounts to a single saying: being, by speaking, enjoys. It's on page 105. And before you go there, all glossy-eyed and philosophical, just take a second and recall what Lacan means by being here. Being, he says, is a being who speaks, a speaking being. In other words, a body that speaks. And where it speaks, it enjoys, Lacan goes on to clarify. But there's more at stake here than the speaking body and its commensurate enjoyments. Note, for instance, the contexts in which these repeated sayings occur. In both instances, knowledge also figures prominently, notably the relations between conscious knowledge, unconscious knowledge, and corporal knowledge, just as we've been discussing them. Consider the context here. Page 104 to 105 gives you the context for the first saying. I will begin with my difficult formulations, Lacan says. Or at least I assume they must be difficult. And then there are quotation marks around this because he's offering a saying. The unconscious is not the fact that being thinks, though that is implied by what is said thereof in traditional science. And then he gives us another phrase in quotation marks. The unconscious is the fact that being, by speaking, enjoys. And, I will add, wants to know nothing more about it. I will add that that means know nothing about it at all. Turn forward a few more pages, bottom of 114, top of 115, and you get him repeating this saying, this crucial saying, in these final chapters. The gap inscribed in the very status of jouissance qua dimension, D-I-T mention, as in the said mention. We'll talk about that as well. The gap inscribed in the very status of jouissance qua dimension of the body in the speaking being is what reemerges with Freud. And I'm not saying anything more than him. Through the test constituted by the existence of speech. Where it speaks, it enjoys. And that doesn't mean that it knows anything, because as far as I've heard, the unconscious has revealed nothing to us about the physiology of the nervous system, the process of getting a hard-on, or early ejaculation. Decent passages with which to begin, wouldn't you agree? Lacan sums all of this up at the start of Chapter 10, and we're not there yet, myself included, so I'll just tell you what he says, with the idea being that we'll get there soon enough. At the start of Chapter 10, he sums this up by saying, I speak without knowing it. I speak with my body, and I do so unbeknownst to myself. Thus, I always say more than I know. This, Lacan says, is the very backbone of my teaching. With this added emphasis on knowledge, conscious, unconscious, and corporal alike, we have the holy conceptual trinity of Seminar 20, knowledge, enjoyment, and the speaking body. There it is. And I think at this point we are well poised in our reading of this key text in Lacanian Psychoanalysis to further show how this trinity hangs together. So let's start at the beginning of things for us with the question of knowledge, the function and the question of knowledge. And then I want to consider the economy of jouissance that is attendant with regard to this knowledge. And at every step along the way, we can flag down that speaking body. Now, it's not all going to unfold in exactly that way, but this is the conceptual and clinical trinity that we're starting to describe here. Knowledge, enjoyment, and the speaking body. And we're going to try and take them in turn. The three types of knowledge at play in Seminar 20, conscious, unconscious, and corporal, they can be divided into two subsets and further divided from there. The two subsets are the said and the saying. So I've got the board up behind me so you can see this, and we can start writing some of this stuff out. There's knowledge at the top, and what I'm saying here is that it breaks down into the said and the saying. The three types of knowledge can be divided into these two subsets and further divided from there, which we're going to do. On the side of the said, we have two, and on the side of the saying, we have one. Conscious knowledge, on the side of the said, as well as unconscious knowledge as well. And on the side of the saying, you're going to have corporal knowledge. I'm writing it up here because as we start moving through this material, it's going to be useful for you to recall how this thing is mapping out. It really does require a bit of diagrammatic work to show you how it all hangs together, it seems to me. Or at least to show you how I think this shit hangs together. So, conscious and unconscious knowledge are both functions of the said. And we're going to explain what that means. But they're functions of the said. So they go on the side of knowledge that has to do with the said, that D-I-T, that Lacan's been talking about here in the early 1970s. We access and account for both conscious and unconscious knowledge by studying what is said by individual speakers. Not their acts of speaking, not their acts of saying, but their choice of words. In Lacan's French, the word for said is again D, spelled D-I-T. Conscious knowledge and unconscious knowledge, he says, are dimensions, D-I-T mentions, because they are mentions of what is said. Mansions as well, pay attention to this, from the Latin mansio, meaning dwelling. These are places where the said dwells. What is said when we speak in varying degrees of conscious awareness and unconscious motivation is a mention of what's been said before us that resides in the very same mansio, or mansion, if you like to think of it that way, namely that of signifying articulation, aka language. The dimension of conscious knowledge and unconscious knowledge is a linguistic dimension. But the dimension of conscious knowledge is not the same as that of unconscious knowledge. Conscious knowledge is a dimension in which meaning trumps speaking. Signifieds over signifiers over speaking bodies. That is the hierarchy when it comes to conscious knowledge. In the field of conscious knowledge, what's said is always making sense, but never anew, because the sense it makes is founded on what's already been said and known up to that point. Conscious knowledge, if you follow me here, is about what's already been said and thus, as a result, able to be said again, and already known by others as well, and thus knowable for one's self thereafter. Simply put, it's what must be learned. If you've got ears to hear, I'm not just talking about the symbolic here. It's the big other, that treasure trove of Lacanian lore that I'm queuing up. And the pages that are helping me do this are 96 to 97. Check it out. Take a listen. Do we need this whole detour to raise the question of knowledge in the form, what is it that knows? Do we realize that it is the other, such as I posited at the outset, as a locus in which the signifier is posited, and without which nothing indicates to us that there is a dimension of truth anywhere, a dimension, D-I-T mention, he emphasizes here, the residence of what is said, right? The mansion, the mansio, the dwelling place of the D of what is said, you see? The residence of what is said, of this said, whose knowledge posits the other as locus. The status of knowledge implies as such that there already is knowledge, that it is in the other, and that it is to be acquired. That is why it is related to learning. The subject results from the fact that this knowledge must be learned, and even have a price put on it. In other words, it is its cost that values it, not as exchange, but as use. Knowledge is worth just as much as it costs, a pretty penny, in that it takes elbow grease, and that it's difficult. Difficult to what? Less to acquire than to enjoy it. In the enjoying, the conquest of this knowledge is renewed every time it is exercised, the power it yields always being directed toward its jouissance. Note this turn from conscious knowledge into the topic of enjoyment. The dimension of conscious knowledge, in which what's known and said can be known and said again, encore, without the space between the N and the C. It's a locus of learning, acquiring, conquering, in short, having, that subjugates and subjectifies the living individual, and in such a way that makes enjoyment difficult. Now, I said we'd wait to talk of jouissance until we spoke about the three types of knowledge, conscious, unconscious, and corporal. But you know what? The more I think about it, the more I think it might make sense to address this difficult jouissance of conscious knowledge here, while we've got this one, conscious knowledge, in focus. The difficult enjoyment that comes with learning, possessing, and exercising conscious knowledge is, wait for it, Phallic enjoyment, exactly as we've been discussing it in this series. And once more, the difficulty on display here is not so much our own as that of Phallic enjoyment itself. It's our jouissance, not ourselves, that is to blame. And for all the reasons we've discussed. Because enjoyment that is phallic stakes our would-be satisfaction on universals that it is not and cannot ever reach. Because it does this, it continually comes up short, fails to deliver, and ultimately lets us down. Phallic enjoyment is, to borrow Lacan's expression at the start of Chapter 9 in Seminar 20, insufficient jouissance. This becomes readily apparent, I think, in the dimension of conscious knowledge, which has a certain inertia built into it, to such an extent, Lacan quips, that there's no point in even asking which of its tireless repetitions of what's known and what's said came first. You want to know what Lacan means by structure, especially as it relates to conscious thought and language use? It amounts to inertia, baby. Page 110 gives us a great riff on this topic, one I couldn't resist. The structure of thought is based on knowledge, Lacan says in the middle of page 110. The said language, that's the only thing that's new in the term structure. Others do what they like with it, but what I point out is that the said language brings with it considerable inertia. This becomes particularly problematic, I think, when jouissance gets involved, especially when it's a jouissance of the one, a jouissance premised, nay, wagered, on the satisfaction of oneness, wholeness, union, plenitude, and all those other damned universals we've discussed. Lacan is all over this once more in chapter 9, and just after the riff on inertia we read. Consider the very next page, page 111. What possible relationship can there be between the articulation that constitutes language and the jouissance that reveals itself to be the substance of thought, of that thought so easily reflected in the world by traditional science? That jouissance is the one that makes it such that God is the supreme being, and that supreme being can, as Aristotle said, be nothing other than the locus in which the good of all the others is known. That doesn't have much to do with thought, does it? If we consider it to be dominated above all by the inertia of language. The inertia of language. And now we've got the universal good of God once more. And Lacan's point here is that there's simply no comparison between the inertia of language and the universal good of God, and certainly no way to cross the chasm of phallic enjoyment that separates the inertia of language from the universal good of God. In the dimension of conscious knowledge, this chasm is not just visible, but palpable. There's the insufficient enjoyment we obtain through repeated acquisitions and aspirations and applications of what's already been said and known, thus rendered inert. Once more, Encore. And then there's the enjoyment that we expect in return from this, that other satisfaction epitomized in the universal good of a supreme being that we simply ain't, no matter how hard we try, which is of course why in the phallic field we never stop trying. We simply must try, because we also simply must fail. Phallic enjoyment, you've heard me say it, is necessary enjoyment. And we can start troubling that category, because I think Lacan is doing this as well once we get back into some of the other modal logics, especially around contingency. But for now, phallic enjoyment remains, as he and we have described it, necessary enjoyment. It must be, and it must fail, because we are beings who speak. So also with conscious knowledge. It compensates for inertia, but also ensures and sustains it by striving for an omniscience that doesn't exist and never will. Indeed, choose your epistemology, And this is what you'll see. A knowledge apparatus premised on fantasies of consciousness that compensate for inertia, its own structural inertia, and in so doing, nevertheless winds up ensuring it, because it's constantly striving for an omniscience that doesn't exist and never will. Complete knowledge is a fucking ruse. On page 111 to 112 of our version of Seminar 20, Lacan attempts to capture this aspect of conscious knowledge and its attendant economy of phallic enjoyment by distinguishing jouissance obtained from jouissance expected. This is a great passage. It's on page 111. It starts about middle of the way down, and it continues through page 112. I think this stuff is fabulous in terms of understanding once and for all what's going on with phallic enjoyment. Check it out. Last year, Lacan says, I myself am surprised as I get older that last year's things seem 100 years away to me. I took as my theme a formulation that I felt I could base on the Borromean knot. I ask you to refuse what I offer you because that's not it. So he's referring back to Seminar 19 or worse, and this chapter about, or this lesson about asking someone to refuse what they're being offered because that ain't it. We've discussed this in our previous series. You can check it out. You can check out that chapter too. He's referring back to Seminar 19 with this phrase, I ask you to refuse what I offer you because that's not it. And he thinks that's relevant here to understanding obtained versus expected jouissance. That formulation, Lacan continues, is carefully designed to have an effect like all those I proffer. See l'étourdi. I didn't say the saying remains forgotten, and so on. I said the fact that one says. Similarly, here, I did not say because that's all it is. So note what's happening. Lacan starts by saying, check out what we were doing in Seminar 19. Last year when I queued up this phrase, I asked you to refuse what I offered. Now, that's a saying. And it's important to have this in mind as he starts moving into the question of the saying and the said and all that here. A saying for Lacan is an embodied act of speech, but it's also an axiom. It's also a phrase. It's also a bumper sticker, as we often refer to it here. Here the saying is, I ask you to refuse what I offer you because that's not it. And then what he's saying is, the following summer, after I queued all this shit up in Seminar 19, I wrote this essay called L'étourdi. We also have a series on L'étourdi. He's saying, check out this essay. He's been saying it throughout Seminar 20. Read L'étourdi is what he's asking you to do. He assumes that people are going to take his word on this, but not many people have. And I doubt many people will. Just take a look at that damn thing, which again is why we have a series on it. But even the most cursory glance at L'étourdi finds at the very start a very keen saying, a phrase. And he's queuing it up again here. The fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is heard in what is said and what is understood. And you see what I'm saying? The key part of this phrase that he wants for us is the fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard, by which he could also mean in what is understood. The second part of that sentence is not as important here as the first, as we're going to see, and that's why he's got it queued up here. The fact that one says. And his point is that these careful formulations matter. It matters that he's putting it this way. So we will indeed take him at his word. But not quite yet. He's just queuing it up. Right now, it's phallic jouissance that we still have our eyes on. That's not it. Here's your phrase again. Is the very cry by which the jouissance obtained is distinguished from the jouissance expected. It is here that what can be said in language is specified. Negation certainly seems to derive therefrom, but nothing more. And I'll leave you to wonder about the type of negation he's queuing up here, and if indeed there may be a masculine formula that relates to it. Nevertheless, he's back on the topic of structure. Structure, which connects up here, demonstrates nothing if not that it is of the same text as jouissance, insofar as in marking by what distance jouissance misses the jouissance that would be in question if that were it. Structure does not presuppose merely the jouissance that would be it. It also props up another. Voila, the dimension, spelled D-I-T. That's not it. This is one of the phrases that we're starting with here, one of the sayings. The jouissance obtained by the acquisition and application of conscious knowledge is not the jouissance we expect to experience as a result. It's as simple as that. The jouissance obtained through the learning of conscious knowledge is simply not the jouissance we expect to experience as a result of this education. You've heard this before in other terms. Once a son, never a father. Not in the way we wish. Once castrated, never uncut, but ever fantasizing about just that, even as we dream of the former. Right? Most dreams are dreams of falling apart, Lacan says. They're fundamentally dreams of castration. We fantasize about being uncut, but all we ever dream about is falling to pieces. Ch8-9a. There does not exist, never was, and never shall be anyone capable of naysaying the phallic function, which is why we can't stop searching for them. And remember why there can't exist anyone who naysays the phallic function, because to say nay or anything else is to prove its domination. It's to prove the phallic function. It's to activate the phallic function because it's the language function. So let's see if we can sum this up. With the structure of consciousness in thought and knowledge alike comes the inertia of the said language, as Lacan puts it, that dimension. And with this inertia comes the expectation of something else entirely, a jouissance that would be if we weren't mired in the jouissance that must be. And in comparison to this would-be jouissance, the jouissance that must fail us as well. Our phallic enjoyment of conscious knowledge, Lacan concludes, is like the spectrum of white light, on the sole condition that one sees that the jouissance at stake is outside the field of that spectrum. Just keep reading on page 112, you'll get there. And I think to myself, what a terrific metaphor for phallic enjoyment and how it works. This spectrum of white light in which the light at stake is outside. What a terrific metaphor for the distance between jouissance obtained and jouissance expected. And that's exactly as Lacan sees it. I can't help but turn us back to page 112 here. It's great stuff. It's the final paragraph of section 3 here on page 112. And Lacan's keen on this metaphor of spectrum of white light. It's a question of metaphor, he says. Regarding the status of jouissance, we must situate the false finality as corresponding to the pure fallacy of a jouissance that would supposedly correspond to the sexual relationship. In this respect, all of the jouissances are but rivals of the finality that would be constituted if jouissance had the slightest relationship with the sexual relationship. You know, of all the universals to which phallic enjoyment fails to live up to, I think we can say this is the biggie. It fails to live up to that of the sexual rapport. a sexual rapport which also doesn't exist, and a sexual rapport whose non-existence leaves us not just flat, but the flattest of all. Now, I told you there are three types of knowledge at play in Seminar 20. Conscious, unconscious, and corporal. The first subset that you see on the screen in front of you is that of the said. This is that dimension that we've been talking about. And it includes conscious and unconscious knowledge as its two subsets. So you can see we've got knowledge, and then it breaks down into the said or the saying. And on the side of the said, we've got conscious knowledge and unconscious knowledge. We'll come to the second subset, this saying, and with it corporal knowledge, soon enough. For now, though, I want to remain focused on the said, the other field of knowledge contained therein, namely the unconscious. You see, there is the said that includes conscious knowledge, but there's this other field of knowledge contained also in this dimension, in this said mansion, namely the unconscious. And I think we need to focus on this just one more time. I always think just one more time, but this is a central theme of this seminar. It's a central theme of Lacanian psychoanalysis. How could it not be? It's arguably the central theme of psychoanalysis itself, in theory and technique. So don't be surprised. I always will just say, let's do it one more time, and we're going to try and do it better than we did the last. If conscious knowledge is known, unconscious knowledge is unknown. Let's start with the basics and ramp up. Some of this unknown knowledge can become known, and some of it cannot. So you have to also remember this about the unconscious. It's a field of unknown knowledge, and some of this knowledge can become known, but most of it cannot. In other words, the unconscious is a field of unknown knowledge, some of which is knowable, and some of which is unknowable. And so you can add some elements here to help you understand what's going on with the said. So conscious knowledge has to do with what is known. Unconscious knowledge has to do with what is unknown. But the field of unknown knowledge that is the unconscious breaks down itself into two other subsets. There's unknown knowledge which is knowable, and unknown knowledge which is unknowable. Notice how these things are coming down schematically for us to consider. This is quite an elaborate family tree. I think this presupposes some important stuff. It presupposes that some unconscious knowledge can be said and some of it cannot. If some of it can be known and some of it cannot, that means that some of it can be said and some of it cannot be said. Unconscious knowledge that can be known is unconscious knowledge that can be said. And unconscious knowledge that cannot be known is unconscious knowledge that cannot be said. So notice what we're doing here. The knowable is unconscious knowledge that can also be said. In fact, what is said from the unconscious is the prerequisite to having its knowability realized or actualized. Notice the able part at the end. The modality here, technically speaking, is that of potentiality. You have the capacity to know some of the unconscious. And what happens when you actualize that capacity? It passes into reality, in the Aristotelian sense of actuality or existence. So pay attention at each stage how the modes keep popping up here. But also notice the hook. It's a hook you're already familiar with, but that I think needs to be reiterated here as this family tree of knowledge starts to break out into little subcategories. It's only by way of what can be said and known of the unconscious that we deal with what cannot be said and known about it. So unconscious knowledge is knowable in some senses, and unknowable in many more. But notice this. It's by way of what can be said and known, by way of the knowable, that we deal with what cannot be said and known about the unconscious, with its unknowable side. That's how we deal with it. I'm not going to say we access it. I'm going to say we deal with it by way of the knowable. I think this is what Lacan means when he describes the unconscious as a dimension of unknown knowledge. It's by way of the said, with all its twisted pathways, as he puts it, that we travel the royal road of the unconscious. And here I've got another passage for you. It's on page 100 at the beginning of this complement, as it says here on page 100. I hardly ever talk about what comes out when it is something by me, especially since I generally have to wait so long for it that my interest in it wanes. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be bad for the next time if you read something I entitled L'étourdi, that begins with the distance there is between saying, dire, and the said, di. Now, here we are again. Lacan is once more reiterating, y'all need to check out this essay. And I'm going to say the same thing. Y'all need to check out this essay. It's a challenging piece, but again, we've got a series that can help you through it. L'étourdi is crucial to understanding what Lacan's doing at this point in Seminar 20. In fact, I'd say Seminar 20 is really just a follow-up to L'étourdi. He's fleshing out so many themes that are precisely articulated, but also very, very difficultly articulated in L'étourdi. But here he is again. He's saying it'd be great if between now and the next time we got together, y'all sat down and worked through this essay. Why? Because it does a very good job of working through the distance that exists between the saying and the said, the distance that you see on the screen in front of you under knowledge. The fact that being may reside only in what is said, Lacan continues, is a question I'll leave open. It is certain that nothing is said but of being. Yet that does not imply the inverse. On the contrary, and this is something I have said. But notice the French here. He's using the French dire, which is saying. He's also giving us a saying, one more phrase, one more axiom. And here it is. The unconscious is only on the basis of what is said. We can deal with the unconscious only on the basis of what is said, of what is said by the analysand. That, Lacan concludes, is a saying. You see, this is a phrase, this is an axiom, this is a bumper sticker, this is a mantra of sorts. And he's continually returning to this other aspect of saying, not just the embodied corporal dimension in which things are saying. It's tough, right? Because we always want to think about what is said. He's purposefully hanging on this saying part. The dire is saying and the di is the said. And a saying can be a phrase or an axiom, but it is also an act. The act and fact of saying, encore, with a space between the N and the C. That's what he's queuing up here. He thinks this shit is pretty important, and I tend to agree. I don't always agree with things he thinks are extremely relevant, but he keeps pushing on this essay, L'étourdi, and this is the reason why. I think it's definitely worth some attention here. So let's just ask the more basic question with regard to what you just heard. What really is said by the analysand? That's what he says right here. He says that the unconscious is something we access by way of what the analysand has said. Well, what then is said by the analysand? What is said by the analysand that allows analytic treatment to deal with their unconscious? What is it? You know the answer to this question. I told you it's basic, and I told you this was going to be a review. It's the symptom. Symptomatic statements are what is said by the analysand that allows analytic treatment to deal with their unconscious. The symptom is what is said, and it's the basis for any dealing we have with the unconscious. What exactly, then, is the symptom at this point in Lacan's thought? It's the same damn thing it's been since the late 1960s, an enigmatic, nonsensical signifier, the meaning of which we know not, at least at the time of its pronouncement, but also, perhaps, ever after. In conscious knowledge, check it out, signifieds trump signifiers trump speaking bodies. Remember that hierarchy, right? When it comes to unconscious knowledge, however, we're all about the signifier. Note the change in hierarchy when it comes to unconscious knowledge. Signifiers trump signifieds trump speaking bodies. And I mean what I say about nonsense, exactly as I've been saying it since our series on that damned essay, Lettourdi. The symptom that is said by the analysand is a nonsensical signifier. Relative to all the sense-making that recurs in the dimension of consciousness, the symptomatic said of analytic experience comes across as nonsense. It's a slip, a stammer, a forgetting, a miswriting, a lapsus, in short. It's a symptom that on first glance, and perhaps forevermore, makes no sense. That is what a symptom is at this point in Lacan's thought. It is a nice bit of nonsense. Now, you've often heard me say that not all parapraxes, slips of the tongue and the like, rise to the level of symptomatic statements. Here, I want to add a further distinction. All symptoms arrive as nonsensical signifiers, but not all symptoms remain nonsensical signifiers. Indeed, some can be made sense of, which again is precisely what the hystericization of neurotic analysands is designed to do. In analytic experience, the discourse of the hysteric is a way for the analysand to connect their symptomatic signifiers to a host of unconscious signifieds, thereby making sense of their own nonsense. But not all symptomatic signifiers lend themselves to this interpretive process of sense-making. Some simply refuse to cough up the unconscious truths that commanded them into existence. Relative to their nonsense, these unconscious truths remain absent. Note that word, absence, here. If nonsense is what can be said and known of the unconscious, absence is the condition of what cannot be said or known of the unconscious relative to this nonsense. This may sound odd to you, but it's just another way into the analytic discourse, notably the lower half of this matheme, which I'm going to draw for you in a different color so that we can have a good look at it here. And I'm going to draw it underneath unconscious knowledge, just so we have a sense of where it might go. S2, lozenge, S1. And in fact, the more I want to write this as a lozenge, the more I think to myself, we'd probably be better off if we just stuck with the original writing of this as a delta. The delta works pretty well here. But eventually we're going to get to something like a lozenge. I think in a more complicated way, you could say the delta is one aspect of the lozenge. So we can be a little more specific here. I'll let you toy with that because you know what appears between S2 and S1. Functionally speaking, nothing. There's no vector. There's nothing there, which is precisely what we see between S2 and S1. Nothing. Okay, let's keep focused, though, on the unconscious for now. In the position of truth, in the discourse that is analytic, and we can just go ahead and draw the rest of the discourse here because that might help us through. And you know these positions. Upper left-hand corner is agent, upper right-hand corner is other, bottom right is product, bottom left is truth, and you've got vectors between. Check out this thing. Look at this bad boy. One more time for you. In the position of truth, in that lower left-hand quadrant, we see S2. This is S2 as unconscious knowledge, some of which is knowable because it's able to be said in symptomatic statements, and some of which is unknowable because it's unable to be said even in the most symptomatic statements. Now, move to the right, lower right-hand corner. In the position of product, what's produced by this discourse, we see S1, qua symptomatic statement. This is what can be said and thus known, even if only nonsensically at first, of the part of unconscious truth that lends itself to language use. From unconscious knowledge to barred subjectivity to symptomatic expression, you see it right there, S2 to slash to S down to S1. Let your eyes follow that circuit and you'll know exactly what we're doing here. From S2 to barred subject to S1, this is precisely what we see. The contingent production of symptomatic saids, each of which bears a secret and truly peculiar affinity with unconscious knowledge. Those S1s have a secret, I dare say even elective affinity with the unconscious knowledge that commanded them into existence. Peculiar to the point of idiocy, even, Lacan adds, recalling the term's Greek origin. So be careful with this. When he says idiot, he's thinking of that idiotes, which is someone who is particular or peculiar or odd. He thinks that symptoms are odd in this way. That's part of the reason why he says they're idiotic. Now, when I double down on this, I'm not saying that symptoms are dumb. I'm saying they're odd, peculiar, strange, and above all, once more, enigmatic. The jouissance with which they come is truly the oddest jouissance, Lacan puts it. Whether and to what extent its secret affinity with the unconscious can be revealed beyond all this peculiarity, this is the key question. Which is why Lacan invokes Heidegger at the start of Chapter 8 in Seminar 20, specifically Heidegger's return to the ancient Greek word for truth, aletheia. So notice this. You got the idiotes, you've got the origin of the idiot, and now you've got the Greek word for truth, one of the key Greek words for truth, aletheia. Aletheia it's a mashup, basically. You've got the privative prefix a, which basically negates whatever follows it. And then you've got the word lethe, meaning forgetfulness, oblivion, and the like, from the verb lethein, meaning to conceal or to hide. So notice this. Aletheia, because you've got that a on the front of the verb meaning to conceal, or the word lethe meaning oblivion and forgetfulness, it means to unforget. It means to unconceal. Aletheia is a mode of disclosure. It doesn't close up, it discloses. It's an element of discovery. It's discovery, it's unconcealment, it's disclosure. There's a reason why Lacan is returning to Heidegger's return to this Greek term, where truth is built on the privative a being slapped onto the verb to conceal. Truth for Heidegger And an analytic process at this level, what we see is a revelation, an unconcealment. And here's how it works. By way of symptomatic SEDS, unconscious truths can be unconcealed, disclosed, discovered, in short, as you just heard me say, revealed. But not all unconscious truths, of course. Just the unconscious truths that can be said and known. And thus, we can sum it up as follows. By way of nonsense, we can make present what might otherwise have remained absent. But we cannot make everything absent present. Or, put a bit more plainly, in terms we've been using, from unconscious knowledge to conscious knowledge by way of symptomatic SEDS. Notice how we're working these knowledges together. It's a passage from unconscious knowledge to conscious knowledge by way of symptomatic SEDS, those S1s. This is among the twisted pathways of analytic experience, according to Lacan. But again, this is just one among many twisted pathways. Just look at how many twisted pathways you see in the diagram on the screen in front of you of the analytic discourse. This is just one pathway that we're tracing through this thing. Know thyself, hear me now. It is an important part of analysis, and that's what we're talking about here, this Delphic imperative to know thyself. I'm not saying it's irrelevant to psychoanalysis. What you've heard me say is that it's insufficient for a psychoanalysis because it's only ever a part of what the analysand does. Put simply, there's just more to psychoanalysis in theory and technique than aletheia, and by extension, truth. Indeed, there is also the real, which is not the same as truth. See Lettourdie. This is one of Lacan's greatest conceptual insights from this period, if you ask me. He lays it out in that essay, the one I'm encouraging you to read following Lacan's lead here. He lays it out in Lettourdie, and he's at it again in Chapter 8 of Seminar 20. And he begins, much as we have, with truth qua unconscious knowledge as signaled in symptomatic statements. The passage I want you to have in mind is on page 91. It's a good one. It's right where Chapter 8 starts in Seminar 20, and it does a good job of spelling out some of this stuff. Here we go. Today, I will examine once more in what respect the true and the real apparently get confused. So up to this point in Lacan's thought, really up to like the summer of 1972, the truth and the real have lent themselves to a certain confusion. Even Lacan succumbs to this. Here, however, after the summer of 1972, he is really thinking hard about how they're distinct, how the true is not indeed the real. And he wants to remind us how they get confused and why fundamentally they're distinct. The true aims at the real. It's another saying. It's in quotation marks. That statement, is it a statement or is it a saying? I'm guessing it's a saying. Is the fruit of a long reduction of the pretensions to truth. Wherever truth presents itself, asserts itself as if it were an ideal that could be based on speech, it is not so easily attained. If analysis rests on a presumption, it is that knowledge about truth can be constituted on the basis of its experience. That's in part what S2 means. It's the basis for analytic experience in which knowledge about truth is constituted, or at least made possible. In the little writing I gave you of analytic discourse, and he's referring to the diagram on your screen, but also the diagram that appears in different form on page 91. In this little writing, I gave you of the analytic discourse, little a is written in the upper left-hand corner and is supported by S2. Take a look at your screen. Take a look at the diagram on page 91. You see the very same thing. S2 is supporting abject little a up there. It is from that point that it interrogates /s. Now, back up a second and reread this, because it's tricky to know what the it in question is, but I think it'll become clear with one more pass, and this one more complete than the last. In the little writing I gave you of analytic discourse, little a is written in the upper left-hand corner and is supported by S2, in other words, by knowledge insofar as it is in the place of truth. S2 is knowledge in the place of truth. It is from that point that it interrogates /s, the position of the analysand, which must lead to the production of S1, that is, of the signifier by which can be resolved what? Its relation to truth. And note, by the way, it's just after drawing that diagram that you see on page 91 that Lacan then turns to the Greek aletheia. It's here in Greek, but when you transliterate it and read it, you get aletheia. It's written in Greek at the bottom of page 91, but just so you know, that's the term, and it's the turn toward Heidegger and this revelatory process where truth is made sense of via aletheia. It is unconcealed. He thinks that's part and parcel of what the analytic discourse accomplishes. It's not all it accomplishes, because remember, there is this thing, the real. So he begins with truth, qua unconscious knowledge, as signaled in symptomatic statements. That's the passage we just read. Here's my question to you, once more. Where the fuck is the real in this little writing known as analytic discourse? Now, if you look at his version of it on 91, you can see where it is. It's in the gap between these elements where there is no vector in particular. Here on your screen, I have written it as a delta. The delta of impotence that we discovered in seminar 17, now raised to the status of an impossibility. I use this as a placeholder for the real. I've highlighted it here in yellow so you can see where I would locate figures of the real. That's where it is in this little writing known as the analytic discourse. And let me be really clear about this. It ain't there. Where does it show up? Nowhere. And that's precisely Lacan's point. Analyst, analysand, symptom, and even the unconscious, with all its knowable and unknowable truths, can be inscribed. And that's exactly what you see in the analytic discourse. The analyst is inscribed in the upper left-hand corner. The analysand is inscribed in the upper right-hand corner. The symptom is inscribed in the lower right-hand corner. And the unconscious, with all of its knowable and unknowable truths, is that S2 inscribed in the lower left-hand corner. There is no inscription for the real. This highlighting of a yellow delta is just so you can locate it a little more easily. Were we proper, it wouldn't be there at all, this figure. This is exactly what you see wherever we write the analytic discourse, even in the passage we just read. There's nothing there. And here again, I'm just putting the delta in there as a placeholder for us. What we see is every other key element except the real. The real doesn't show up. It can only be written in and as the recesses between these elements. That's the real written. It can be inscribed as recess, as gap. And that's what you see, most notably in the vectorless gap between S2 and S1. You see, all the other elements are connected by vectors, little threads from a spider's belly. But not S1 and S2. They are not connected. There is no direct vector from S2 to S1 or vice versa. What we see here, I think, between unconscious knowledge and symptomatic statement, S2 and S1, is the very thing that makes the analytic discourse a matheme, an impasse of formalization. That's what that yellow triangle is. It's an impasse. And I draw it like this so that you can also envision it as a kind of mountain, as a mountain range, as an impasse or a barrier between unconscious knowledge and symptomatic statement. It is a specific type of impasse, though. It is an impasse of formalization. To illustrate this, I think it's best to redraw this matheme just as we have it up on the screen here. Not as Lacan has it on 91, but as you see it up here on our screen with that yellow mountain range in between. Because I think this is a little more in alignment with how Lacan now draws the analytic discourse. So, let's hit it again, hit it harder. What do you see between unconscious knowledge in the position of truth and symptomatic signifier in the position of product? Not a damn thing. Truth is difficult to reach. There's no doubt about it. It's tough to get from S1 to S2. You can deal with S2 by way of S1, but I dare say you can't quite get to it. Show me the vector that allows you to go from S1 to S2. Follow every arrow you see on your screen in the analytic discourse. There is no pathway to S2. Truth. Here, unconscious truth as S2. It is difficult to reach, maybe even impossible to reach. We can deal with it, but we can't access it. Note, in this S2, two vectors originate, but none return. Talk about something peculiar to note about the analytic discourse. Unconscious truth is the origin of multiple vectors and the destination of none. Which again is why Lacan says it's not so easily attained in the passage we just read, and only ever reached by twisted pathways, by which I mean dealt with by twisted pathways. It's from chapter 8. I'm just quoting from chapter 8 here in Seminar 20. Nothing new here. But you know what? Say what you will about the challenges of reaching unconscious truth in the analytic discourse. At least that motherfucker can be written, diagrammed, inscribed, and formalized. That's what you see with S2. At least it can be written. Not so with the real. I've only included that yellow triangle, that yellow delta, that mountain range for purposes of clarity. You can't write the real in here. It only ever shows up as an impasse, indeed an impossibility, where diagrams, inscriptions, and formalizations fail. So all we could really do here to make this thing do its job of showing you where, but at the same time also showing you what I'm telling you about the real's inability to show up, is we can just cross it out. Just put a red bar through the whole thing so that you know, ain't shit there. That's what I'm saying. It only ever shows up as an impasse, as a breakdown, as an impossibility, where formalizations fail. Now, I'm not saying the real cannot be read. I'm saying it cannot be written. Like the sexual relationship, the real does not stop not being written. And this, of course, is its distinguishing feature. Check out, for instance, page 93. This is where the real distinguishes itself, Lacan says. The real can only be inscribed on the basis of an impasse of formalization. That's what you see with the yellow barred delta of impotence raised to the level of impossibility between S2 and S1 on your screen. It's an inscription on the basis of an impasse of formalization. That is why I thought I could provide a model of it using mathematical formalization, inasmuch as it is the most advanced elaboration we have by which to produce signifierness. The mathematical formalization of signifierness runs counter to meaning. I almost said, and check out the French, which Bruce is really helpful here. In our times, philosophers of mathematics say it means nothing concerning mathematics, even when they are mathematicians themselves, like Russell. Blast down a little bit. What invisibly holds bodies is designated therein. Check out this paragraph. So he just cues up mathematics. He's queuing up the real. It's distinguished by the fact that it can only be inscribed on the basis of an impassive formalization. He thinks this is relevant to mathematics. But note what happens in the very next paragraph. And yet, compared to a philosophy that culminates in Hegel's discourse, a plenitude of contrasts dialectized in the idea of an historical progression, which, it must be said, nothing substantiates for us. Check it out. Can't the formalization of mathematical logic, which is based only on writing, serve us in the analytic process in what invisibly holds bodies is designated therein? If I were allowed to give an image of this, Lacan continues, I would easily take that which in nature seems to most closely approximate the reduction to the dimensions of the surface writing requires, at which Spinoza himself marveled. The textual work that comes out of the spider's belly, its web. It is a truly miraculous function to see, on the very surface, emerging from an opaque point of this strange being, the trace of these writings taking form, in which one can grasp the limits, impasses, and dead ends that show the real acceding to the symbolic. Such a great riff on page 93, dealing with the real. The key passages here have to do with this spider's belly, producing a web that invisibly holds bodies. This is precisely what the analytic discourse is. It's a fucking spider's web in which bodies are invisibly held. And these bodies, my friends, are speaking bodies, as we're going to see. So again, take a look at the diagram on your screen of the analytic discourse. Do you see what I see? Indeed you do. It is a psychoanalytic spider's web in which speaking bodies are invisibly held. And the real, here marked as a formal impasse, accedes to the symbolic, but only in and as its recesses. Like I said, there's more to analysis than aletheia. It's to this more that we're going to turn next time.